Laura West had never considered herself sentimental, but there were things in life that carried weight beyond logic, like the truck. It sat at the edge of her driveway, not quite gleaming, not exactly rusting either. A 1968 Ford F100, faded seafoam green, with chrome that still caught the sun in places. It hadn't moved in almost a year, and it wasn't exactly roadworthy anymore, but Laura didn't care. That truck wasn't just an object. It had been given to her by her estranged father on her 18th birthday, back when words between them still meant something and before silence became their language. Since then, it had followed her through every move, every relationship, and every failure. Not out of necessity, but loyalty. Her loyalty. It had outlasted boyfriends, leases, even her brief stint trying to go modern and lease a hybrid. The truck was the last piece of her that felt rooted. Laura was 34 now, a ceramic artist with a small but steady client base. She lived alone in a single-story ranch-style home just outside Portland, in a neighborhood that was quiet, moderately upscale, and governed by an association of homeowners who seemed to confuse suburban order with personal power. She avoided them when she could, preferring the solitude of her workshop where she shaped clay into something people paid real money for: vases, planters, and the occasional commissioned sculpture. She wasn't rich, but she wasn't struggling either, just balanced on that tightrope where one unexpected blow could send everything sideways. The truck, though parked, represented something resilient. She'd sometimes sit in the cab on late evenings, cassette deck humming softly, and imagine her mother's voice. That truck had carried memories in its ashtray and glove box, long after the people tied to them had vanished. So when she stepped outside one morning, coffee in hand, expecting to see the familiar silhouette at the edge of the gravel, and found only an oil stain and scattered leaves, her first instinct wasn't panic. It was confusion. She blinked, thinking maybe she'd parked it somewhere else or that a neighbor had moved it as a joke. But the silence in her chest told a different story. Something had happened. No note, no call. Just absence. And when she called the local towing company, the answer she got was clinical, matter-of-fact. The truck had been removed following a request submitted by the neighborhood association. No further details. No explanation of why, no warning was given. No courtesy, just gone. And that was when something old and hot rose in her throat. Not just anger, but something deeper. Something like betrayal. The hold music on the line with the towing company was a hollow, tinny melody that Laura barely registered as she waited for a supervisor, her phone pressed to her ear while she stared at the patch of gravel where her truck had stood for years. When someone finally answered, their voice was sharp and indifferent, like they had repeated this same conversation a dozen times today alone. Yes, the truck had been towed. Yes, the request came from the neighborhood board. Yes, it was classified as a visual blight. A non-operational vehicle parked long-term in a visible space. Laura cut them off there, her voice tight but calm. The truck had valid registration. She paid her vehicle tax. There was no city ordinance that prohibited storing a personal vehicle on a private driveway. The voice on the other end, now slightly annoyed, told her that under the community guidelines filed with her development's residential agreement, an agreement she realized with rising discomfort that had come stapled to a mountain of paperwork when she bought the house 4 years ago. The board retained discretion over all visible elements of the property, including vehicles in a state of disrepair or visually inconsistent with community standards. She didn't remember signing anything like that, but maybe she had. In the haze of mortgage documents and title insurance, it could have easily passed unnoticed. Still, nothing explained why there hadn't been a notice. No letter, no knock, no email. The woman at the towing company sighed, told her the notification had been posted as required through an online portal associated with the community board. Laura had never used the portal. She hadn't even set up an account. Apparently, that didn't matter. The rules had been followed. The truck had been tagged, processed, and towed. If she wanted it back, she would have to contact the board directly. Or better yet, take it up with the property services firm contracted by the association. An hour later, Laura stood in front of the offices of Chasewood Property Management, a squat beige building wedged between a sandwich shop and a dry cleaner, clutching a printout of her vehicle's registration and a folded photo of the truck taken on, her front lawn 3 years ago, with her standing beside it holding a half-glazed planter. At the front desk, she was met by a young man in a too-tight dress shirt who glanced at her paperwork, tapped a few keys on his computer, and gave her a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The removal had been authorized by a board member named Greta Thompson. That name snapped into focus instantly. Greta, the thick-set woman with aggressively floral cardigans, who had introduced herself on Laura's first day with a plate of underbaked cookies and a 5-minute monologue on what keeps a neighborhood clean. Laura had never really spoken to her after that, aside from a few forced nods at the mailbox. She asked if she could speak to someone in charge, someone with authority to halt the process. The receptionist told her politely that the truck was now classified as non-recoverable. What did that even mean? He clarified. After being impounded for more than 48 hours under visual nuisance classification, the vehicle could be transferred to municipal surplus or recycling, depending on condition. If she wished to dispute the board's decision, she could submit a written appeal, but processing time for those was typically 4 to 6 weeks. Her truck didn't have 4 to 6 weeks. It had maybe days before it disappeared into a compactor. Back home, she sat in the cab of her Subaru, engine idling, staring at the empty space in her driveway and chewing the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. Every time she closed her eyes, she pictured the interior of that truck, the cracked leather bench seat, the cassette of her mother's favorite band wedged halfway into the stereo, the way the dashboard still smelled faintly of old upholstery and cigarette smoke. There had been things in the glove box, a few photos, a ring her mother used to wear that Laura couldn't bring herself to throw out after the accident. Not irreplaceable on paper, maybe, but they were pieces of her life that no one had any right to touch. She didn't call the police. She knew what they'd say, that it was a civil issue, not a crime. She didn't scream at the property management company or barge into Greta's home. What she did was drive downtown and walk into the offices of a nonprofit legal assistance clinic that one of her clients had once mentioned in passing. She explained her situation to the intake clerk with calm clarity, resisting the urge to cry or rant. The clerk, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s with tortoiseshell glasses, took notes, asked a few follow-up questions, and promised to assign the case to a staff attorney. The next day, Laura got a call from a lawyer named Sarah Gerber, who said in a measured professional tone that this wasn't the first time she had heard of a residential board pushing the limits of its authority. She told Laura to sit tight while she filed an emergency request to freeze any further transfer or destruction of the vehicle. For the first time since the truck vanished, Laura let herself exhale. She didn't have a plan, not exactly, but she had momentum. The game was no longer one-sided, and as she stood in her now quiet driveway, arms crossed and wind tugging gently at her hair, she felt something shift. Not rage, not even hope. Just the first flicker of resistance. It started with the flyers. Laura didn't notice them at first. Her focus had narrowed in recent days to a laser-point fixation on legal filings, voicemail messages, and email threads with Sarah Gerber, whose updates came in crisp, efficient summaries that masked the massive effort behind each line. But one morning, as Laura returned from the grocery store, her arms full of bags and her thoughts wrapped around a draft appeal Sarah was submitting, she caught sight of a square of paper flapping under a neighbor's porch light. Then another one slipped beneath a windshield wiper on a parked SUV. Curious and with a sinking in her gut that she had learned to trust, she set down the groceries and walked to the edge of her neighbor's driveway. The flyer was printed on cheap paper, black and white with bold text at the top. Is this the kind of neighborhood we want? Below it, a grainy photo of Laura's truck taken from across the street, clearly zoomed in, probably from a phone. The caption read, "One homeowner's refusal to maintain standards affects us all." It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't anonymous. In the bottom right corner, the name Greta Thompson appeared in a faux handwritten script, along with her title, Community Standards Committee Chair. Laura stared at the page until her fingers crumpled the edge, then walked back to her house with a weight that had nothing to do with the bags she left behind. This wasn't just about a truck. It was a campaign, a smear. Greta had turned it into a public referendum, one that Laura hadn't agreed to be a part of. Within days, more signs followed. Neighbors she didn't even know began giving her long, appraising looks, and some, the ones who used to nod politely, now crossed to the other side of the street. Only a few offered quiet gestures of support. A thumbs up from the retired guy with the birdhouses, a murmured good luck from the woman walking her spaniel. But they were rare, and they were whispered. No one wanted to be next. Inside her home, Laura found herself tiptoeing, irrationally careful not to look provocative. not to be seen as the cause of noise or disruption. She stopped working in her outdoor ceramic studio for a few days, letting pieces go unfinished in the kiln, just so no one could accuse her of being a nuisance. At night, she kept the blinds closed tight. One morning, she found a coffee cup tossed over her fence, its contents staining the gravel like a warning. Another day, her trash can had been dragged into the street and overturned. Nothing dramatic, nothing she could prove, but the message was clear. She was being pushed, nudged out, humiliated, exhausted into compliance. Sarah, always composed, responded with increasing layers of documentation. She filed an injunction request to freeze all movement on the truck's status and pushed for a hearing date. She dug through municipal code and residential agreements, zeroing in on a clause that required visible notification for any vehicle removal from private property, a notice that Laura had never received. In the meantime, Sarah also advised Laura to start building a separate case, something that would shift the power dynamic. Not just to get the truck back, but to elevate its status, to force the board to recognize it not as a nuisance, but as an artifact, a protected item. Laura was skeptical, but she agreed to a consultation with an automotive appraiser Sarah had worked with before. The man's name was Reuben Ashcroft, and he arrived 2 days later in a battered leather jacket and vintage horn-rimmed glasses, his hands stained with grease despite the clipboard he carried. He was in his 60s, with a voice like gravel and an encyclopedic knowledge of vintage American pickups. Laura walked him through the details, showed him old photos, registration records, parts receipts. He nodded often, scribbled in a tight, angular hand, asked intelligent, precise questions. By the time he finished, he leaned against her fence and said, "You've got a surviving variant of the '68 Fleet Classic. Only a handful with that exact trim package still exist. That's no junker, that's legacy." He agreed to draft a report and submit it to both the Historical Vehicle Registry and the Preservation Review Board. When the document arrived, it was more detailed than Laura expected, complete with references to archival parts catalogs, comparison images, and statements about the model's significance to post-war American industrial design. Sarah took one look and said, "This changes everything." Now, any move against the truck would have to pass through preservation criteria. The removal wasn't just inconvenient, it was potentially illegal under new context. Meanwhile, Greta escalated. Laura received an official-looking envelope with a letterhead that mimicked legal formatting. It accused her of violating community harmony, cited arbitrary noise complaints, and warned of possible fines for improper landscaping. Sarah read the letter and laughed for the first time since they'd met. "This is desperation," she said, "but document everything. They're trying to bait you." Laura remained calm. She didn't retaliate, didn't yell, didn't pound on doors or call the media. She photographed every flyer, every letter, every piece of vandalism. She kept logs of dates and times. She installed a motion-activated light by her front gate. Not a camera, but enough to suggest one. Quiet defiance. She started working in her studio again, kept the door open, let the smell of clay and kiln drift through the air. The final straw came when Sarah received a notice that the board had filed a petition to restrict storage of historically aged but non-functioning vehicles within visible proximity of any residence, effective immediately, clearly aimed directly at Laura. But what they didn't anticipate was that their own bylaws hadn't been properly updated through public vote. Sarah filed a formal rebuttal within hours, challenging the board's legitimacy on procedural grounds. And then she did something else, something strategic. She reached out to a regional preservation society and submitted Laura's case to their review committee. It wasn't a lawsuit yet, but it was no longer a private dispute. The board's actions had entered the realm of regulatory scrutiny, and suddenly Greta's flyers didn't feel like warnings. They felt like evidence. It was early afternoon when Laura received the call that marked the shift in everything. The moment when the emotional storm that had been building for weeks began to take form, not just in her heart, but in paper, legal code, and bureaucratic weight. The voice on the other end was soft-spoken but certain, and it belonged to a woman named Marion Keyes from the Northwest Historical Vehicle Preservation Society. Sarah had submitted the documentation Reuben Ashcroft compiled, along with photos, ownership records, and the formal rebuttal to the residential board's newly proposed regulation. What surprised Laura most wasn't that the society had taken interest. Sarah had hinted it might happen, but that Marion's tone wasn't inquisitive. It was reverent. She referred to the truck not as the vehicle or the unit, but the classic Fleet 68, as if speaking about a museum piece. She asked Laura only one question. Would you be willing to allow a site visit for archival purposes? The language was so deliberate, so respectful, that Laura momentarily forgot the stress that had consumed her for days. Her voice when she answered was steady. Yes, of course. 2 days later, Marion arrived, not alone, but with a photographer, an archivist, and a clipboard stacked with consent forms. Laura didn't have the truck in her driveway, but she had the photos, documents, maintenance logs, the interior layout sketched from memory, and more importantly, Ruben's full write-up with notarized valuation. They spent hours with her. They asked questions about the truck's origin, how long it had been in her family, and if she had any remaining parts or accessories. Marion even asked about the cassette deck. Laura showed her a photo where it was visible beneath a sun-faded Hank Williams tape. The archivist nodded and wrote something down. They thanked her, and before leaving, Marion said something that caught Laura off guard. This board doesn't realize they've stepped into a different kind of fight. They've moved into cultural jurisdiction, and that's a place where people like us are very loud. Later that evening, Sarah confirmed it. The Preservation Society had initiated a formal review. That meant the truck, even if not in Laura's possession, was now flagged in state databases as a potential cultural asset. Any action toward disposal, deconstruction, or auction had to be cleared through state-level review. In one move, the entire board's strategy had been frozen. But the board didn't go silent. Instead, they adapted. Days after the site visit, Laura returned from the grocery store to find a laminated notice zip-tied to her fence gate, formatted like a government citation but clearly produced on a home printer. It accused her of excessive visual clutter and included photos not just of her studio but of her front garden, where potted plants sat unevenly arranged along the walkway. It ended with a warning. Continued disregard for visual ordinances could result in landscape remediation fees. It was nonsense, but it was tactical. Death by 1,000 paper cuts. Sarah's advice was clear. Do not respond to them directly. Every communication must go through me. And if they show up, you do not engage. Just document. That night, Laura moved the plants. Not because she agreed, but because she refused to give them another point of attack. Then she went back into her studio and worked until well after midnight. Her hands stained with clay, her mind consumed not with strategy, but with grounding. Creation, she reminded herself, was resistance too. The next week brought another shift, this time from the board itself. A newsletter went out across the neighborhood, delivered to every mailbox in thick, glossy print. The cover featured staged photos of freshly mowed lawns, bright porch lights, American flags waving gently in evening sun. Inside was a full-page statement from Greta Thompson about restoring neighborhood pride and reclaiming aesthetic harmony. The language was loaded, veiled, almost coded. It never mentioned Laura by name, but one paragraph stood out. There are those who believe individual preference should outweigh collective well-being. We do not agree. The neighborhood must not be reduced to a patchwork of stubborn nostalgia and neglected relics. Laura didn't need to read between the lines. She was the stubborn nostalgia. Her truck was the relic. They were making her the symbol of decline, of disorder masked as tradition. But this time, Laura didn't flinch. Sarah had sent a copy of the newsletter to the Preservation Society, and they responded swiftly. A formal notice was sent to the board's registered address, warning that their language could constitute a campaign of harassment and that any further targeting of an ongoing heritage review could be seen as interference with the state cultural process. Marion followed it with a call to Laura that was gentler. You're doing everything right, but this is the part where they'll try to break you quietly. Stay grounded. What grounded Laura wasn't anger. It wasn't even pride. It was memory. One night, when the house was still and the neighborhood quiet again, she found herself sitting in the middle of her studio floor, surrounded by finished and unfinished pieces. In her lap was an old shoebox where she'd kept clippings, old service receipts, and a few dried flowers once wedged in the rearview mirror of the truck. She wasn't crying. She wasn't scared. She was present, and for the first time in weeks, that felt like enough. The next morning, Laura stepped outside and saw Greta standing 2 doors down, speaking animatedly with another neighbor. Their eyes met. Greta held her gaze for a beat, then looked away. And that, more than the legal motions or the archival letters, felt like a shift. Not a win. Not yet. But a crack in the performance. Laura smiled, small, calm, and deeply intact. The silence didn't last. For all the warnings and formal notices, Laura knew the board wouldn't back down just because she'd gained institutional support. Greta, in particular, seemed to thrive on resistance, feeding off it like it gave her purpose. The pressure didn't lessen, it shifted, took on new shapes. A week after the newsletter circulated, Laura received a violation notice taped to her front door, printed in bold font and highlighter pen, accusing her of improper lighting and unsafe garden pathways. The timing was no accident. Sarah read through it and immediately filed another response, pointing out the lack of inspection authority and absence of photographic evidence. "It's paper theater," she told Laura on the phone. "They're hoping if they stack enough nonsense, you'll buckle somewhere." But Laura didn't buckle. She documented, scanned, and forwarded everything. She stopped reacting, and that, more than anything, seemed to unnerve them. 2 nights later, she was woken around 3 a.m. by the sound of her motion light snapping on, and the dull, unmistakable sound of something striking her front gate. She moved silently to the window, peeking between the slats of the blinds. Nothing visible. No one standing in the light. But in the morning, she found a fresh smear of eggs across the wooden slats, and several small rocks scattered across her walkway. No messages, no broken windows. Just an escalation that was small enough to seem childish, but unmistakably targeted. The rocks had words written on them in marker. Move. Enough. Clean it up. This time, she reported it. Sarah encouraged her to file an official report, and Laura drove to the station herself, photos in hand, records in place. The officer on duty listened politely but made no promises. There was nothing captured clearly on nearby surveillance. No one had seen anything. "These things tend to burn out," the officer said, with a tone that was meant to sound comforting, but only left Laura colder. She left the station and didn't drive home. Instead, she went to a supply store and bought 2 industrial-grade trail cameras. She mounted them inside her fence, angled low, not for people but for patterns. She wasn't going to try and catch anyone. She was going to record everything that came near her home. Meanwhile, Sarah received a letter from the board's legal consultant, an individual Laura had never heard of, requesting a formal mediation session between Laura and the board to resolve continued disputes. It was thinly veiled posturing. Sarah called it a trap, a way for the board to claim it had tried to reconcile before potentially escalating to civil complaints. She advised declining unless the board agreed to submit a full review of its prior actions regarding the truck and rescind the proposed vehicle regulation ordinance. Unsurprisingly, they refused. The truck itself remained in limbo, physically held in the impound yard, but legally in a kind of stasis, untouchable as long as the Preservation Society's review remained open. Laura had no access to it, but no one could destroy it either. It was a purgatory that left her constantly aware of what had been taken, but unable to move forward. Then came the signature moment that shifted the entire scale of the conflict. One morning, as Laura prepared to meet with a visiting Preservation Board assessor, she discovered her mailbox had been pried open and left hanging by one hinge. Inside wasn't mail, but a sealed manila envelope. No markings, no return address. Cautiously, she took it inside, opened it on the kitchen counter, and unfolded the single-page letter inside. It wasn't typed. It was handwritten in blocky, slightly shaky script. The message was short. "They're doing this because of land." At first it seemed absurd, even conspiratorial, but the next line chilled her. "Yours backs up to the new development site. You didn't hear this from me." That was all. No signature. No contact. She called Sarah immediately. They had discussed zoning before. Nothing in her paperwork suggested anything unusual, but this prompted deeper review. Within days, Sarah uncovered what the letter hinted at. A regional developer, allied with the same legal group advising the board, had recently submitted preliminary proposals for expanding housing units along the Greenbelt, property that, as it happened, ran directly behind Laura's lot. Not part of her property technically, but close enough that anything perceived as unsightly or unattractive would affect valuation and marketing. The presence of an old weathered truck visible in drone footage or marketing shots could reduce the perceived cohesion of the area. Sarah's voice turned sharp. It's not about your truck. It never was. It's about controlling the frame. Armed with this, Sarah submitted an ethics complaint to the state board overseeing residential zoning and development. She included every document, the timing of violations, the newsletter, the removal order, and the preservation review. She CC'd the property registry and the regional planning office. The effect was immediate. The board received a formal inquiry into its conflict of interest disclosures. Greta was not named personally, but the heat began to show. At the next community bulletin, her name was conspicuously absent from the Standards Committee heading. Laura kept her head down, but the shift was undeniable. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now gave her silent nods, cautious but acknowledging. One evening, the older man with the birdhouses came by with a six-pack and wordlessly left it on her porch railing. No explanation, just a gesture. She left it there for hours before finally bringing it inside. And yet, the tension didn't evaporate. That week, Laura caught sight of someone photographing her property from inside a parked sedan down the block. No license plate on the front, tinted windows. The moment their camera rose, she stepped outside and stared straight at them. They drove off slowly without speeding. She didn't chase them. She didn't need to. She simply went back inside, wrote down the time, the direction the car left, and the weather. Every act became record. Every moment became evidence. And though she didn't speak it aloud, one thought now drove everything she did. They were no longer trying to punish her. They were trying to erase her from the equation. And that was something she could never allow. The day of the hearing arrived under a gray, indifferent sky, the kind that hung low over the city like a lid on a boiling pot. It was held not in a courtroom, but in a municipal administrative building. Rows of beige chairs, fluorescent lighting, and a thin carpet that absorbed the tension underfoot. Laura arrived early, dressed simply but with intent, her hair pulled back, her shoulders squared. She was not there to perform. She was there to be heard. Sarah stood beside her, papers clipped and organized, her tone calm as she explained the flow of the session. This wasn't about theatrics. It was about facts, language, and leverage. Across the room sat 3 members of the local Zoning and Property Ethics Review Board, middle-aged professionals whose eyes scanned every document like seasoned accountants. The residential board had sent 2 representatives and, to no surprise, a new legal counsel. Greta was conspicuously absent. The issue at hand had been framed as a procedural dispute over community ordinance enforcement and an alleged overstep in authority regarding private property. What unfolded, however, was something far more precise. Sarah began with a timeline. She laid out the first notice, or rather, the absence of one. She followed with the improper classification of Laura's vehicle, noting that no in-person inspection had occurred, and that the only documented complaint came from a single resident with direct involvement in the Standards Committee. She presented photos of the truck, Ruben's appraisal report, and the formal letter from the Preservation Society. She reminded the panel that the truck was, by then, under active review, and that state statute prohibited the destruction or sale of any vehicle under such designation without formal release. Then came the development link. Sarah introduced the envelope Laura had received and walked the board through the discovery of proposed expansion projects on the adjacent greenbelt. She traced the connection from the board's counsel to the legal firm used by the developers, and from there to the sudden flurry of zoning language revisions that appeared only after Laura's property had been flagged. The argument wasn't shouted. It was laid down in pieces. Each detail, each date, each citation forming a lattice of intent. This was not just about aesthetics or compliance. It was about pressure. It was about value. It was about removing a perceived obstruction to a financial plan. The board listened, asked questions, and took notes. They weren't sympathetic. They weren't cold either. They were methodical. When the board's legal representative was invited to respond, his approach was dismissive at first, suggesting that the community had acted within a reasonable framework of established standards. But when questioned about the lack of formal notice and the connection to private development interests, His responses became halting, legalistic, full of phrases like, "to the best of my knowledge," and "not within my purview." He denied collusion, denied knowledge of the envelope, and suggested the Iyasam truck may not have been of clear historical value at the time of removal. That was when Marion Keyes, seated in the back row for the Preservation Society, stood and asked to submit a final document. It was a provisional classification certificate, dated the previous week, officially designating Laura's truck as a historical vehicle of regional significance. The room went very quiet. The panel called a brief recess, and Sarah leaned toward Laura with a whisper. "This is what it looks like when they start recalculating risk. We just moved from nuisance to liability." When they returned, the board delivered their decision in measured, professional tones. The removal order was invalidated retroactively. The board's actions had not only violated procedural norms but appeared to serve an undisclosed interest not in alignment with their charter. They referred the matter to the County Oversight Office for further review and ordered the immediate return of the vehicle. Furthermore, they advised that any future ordinance changes from the residential board would require public disclosure and a full vote before implementation. Laura sat still as the words landed. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just breathed. After weeks of tension wound so tightly it threatened to fracture her, she let herself exhale. Sarah gathered the documents, nodded once, and whispered, "You just won." 2 days later, Laura stood outside the impound lot as the gate rolled open, and the truck, her truck, was wheeled forward on a flatbed. It wasn't pristine. It hadn't been touched, but it was whole. Still her color. Still her plates. Still the faint scratch on the passenger side from a day that had faded everywhere else but memory. The lot manager handed her the keys, unsigned a release form, and muttered something about paperwork nightmare. Laura didn't respond. She opened the driver's side door, slid into the bench seat, and closed her eyes. The scent hit her first. Dust, leather, something old and familiar. She turned the key. The engine didn't start. She hadn't expected it to. But she sat there, hands on the wheel, heart steady, and thought, they didn't take it. They couldn't. And they never will. When she returned home, the truck came with her, to the driveway it had known for years. But this time, a new placard hung in the window, issued by the Preservation Board. Vehicle under historical protection, do not tow. No one could touch it now. And even if someone tried, she wouldn't be alone anymore. The battle had revealed something else, something unexpected. She had allies now. Quiet ones, professional ones, but solid. People who believed that history didn't belong only in museums. Sometimes it lived on driveways, parked under open skies, held together by memory and the kind of ownership no ordinance could ever dismantle. A month after the ruling, the neighborhood looked the same, but something in its rhythm had shifted. Laura could feel it in the way people walked past her house. No longer avoiding eye contact, no longer glancing sideways at her driveway as if afraid to be seen acknowledging it. The truck sat there, quiet and unmoved, but no longer in exile. Its presence was now a statement, legitimized not just by the placard in the window, but by everything it had withstood. The garden Laura had once stripped of excess to avoid another citation now bloomed freely again. Clay pots lined the path with deliberate asymmetry, each one different, imperfect, unafraid. Her studio reopened at full rhythm, not in silence but in hums of the kiln. Soft clinks of tools and music played low from an old speaker in the corner. Greta never returned to her committee seat. Rumors swirled about internal pressure, about anonymous complaints, about a quiet warning issued from higher offices, but Laura didn't chase them. She didn't need to. The victory was in what remained, in what couldn't be undone. A few neighbors approached her quietly in the weeks that followed. One with questions about a classic motorcycle kept in his garage, another who offered to mow her lawn just as a gesture, and a third who simply said, "You held your ground. I respect that." There were no grand speeches, no apologies from those who had watched in silence. But Laura didn't want that. She wanted her home to feel like hers again. And slowly, it did. On a Sunday morning, she took a folding chair out to the driveway, sat beside the truck with a cup of coffee, and watched the sun rise behind the green belt that had almost become her undoing. The same trees, the same sky, but now they belonged to a place where she had drawn a line and defended it. There was no peace in passivity, she realized. Peace was something you had to protect, not beg for. And sometimes it looked like a truck older than most of the people trying to remove it. A lawyer with a backbone made of steel, and a woman who learned that silence was not the same as surrender.